Call meeting back to order, and we now move to agenda item 2, consideration of a new petition. We have one new petition for consideration this morning, petition 1668 by Glennie on improving literacy standards in schools through research-informed reading instruction. 2 written submissions in support of the petition are included with our meeting papers from Dr Marilyn Grant and Dr Sarah McGeown. I welcome Glennie to the meeting along with Dr McGeown, Senior Lecturer in Development Psychology from the University of Edinburgh, and Gordon Askew, MBE, from the International Foundation for Effective Reading Instruction. You have an opportunity to make a brief opening statement of up to 5 minutes, and after that the committee will ask a few questions to help inform our consideration of the petition.
Thank you, Convener. I'm very grateful for the opportunity to present evidence to the committee. I would especially like to thank Gordon Askew and Dr Sarah McGeown for giving evidence alongside me today. We have chosen to share the 5 minutes for our opening statements. I'm concerned about Scotland's decline in literacy standards. Through no fault of their own, teachers in Scotland lack the necessary deep subject knowledge required to teach reading effectively. This assertion is not new. It was highlighted in the 2014 review of the Scottish Government Literacy Hub approach. Despite being supported by research and being recommended specifically in the Scottish Government's Literacy Action Plan from October 2010, synthetic phonics is not supported by current Curriculum for Excellence documentation, nor is it covered adequately in initial teacher education. Reading research has moved on, but Scotland has not. We are around 12 years behind other countries on this. We cannot afford to wait any longer.
So this petition is about ensuring teachers and teacher training institutions have access to and use research-informed reading instruction to ensure that all children in Scotland can achieve their potential in reading. This is not about removing teacher autonomy, and it's not about implementing a prescriptive approach to the teaching of reading. This is about empowering teachers by ensuring that all teachers have access to the most up-to-date research on children's reading instruction, and then allowing them to make decisions about how best to apply this based on the specific students that they teach. Now, I believe that synthetic phonics has the potential to achieve the Scottish Government's vision of narrowing the poverty-related attainment gap in reading. Children from disadvantaged backgrounds typically start school with weaker vocabularies than children from more affluent backgrounds. What my research has shown is that when children are taught by an eclectic approach to read, that is, are taught a variety of strategies to read new words, such as whole word recognition or use of context, then their language skills predict how well they learn to read. However, when children are taught by a synthetic phonics approach, vocabulary skills do not predict word reading success. If you are committed to narrowing the poverty-related attainment gap in reading, surely it makes sense to educate teachers in a method of instruction which is not dependent on good vocabulary for success. Finally, I know of no research evidence to suggest that synthetic phonics undermines a love of reading. I believe that we are all passionate about ensuring that young children have a joy and interest in books, words and stories from a young age. What we know is that synthetic phonics needs to be positioned within a curriculum which develops broader oral language skills and a love of reading too. Synthetic phonics allows children to become independent readers earlier on, and we know that more skilled readers and independent readers go on to have more positive attitudes towards reading and are more confident and motivated readers.
Good morning, it's good to be with you. Although I am the advisor to the DFE in England, I assure you I am not here because I think you ought to do what England does. I'm here as an individual to share my experience of what I know works with children reading the English language wherever they live. One of the really remarkable things about reading over the past 50 or 60 years is that a lot of children learn to read and pick up reading almost however they are taught. However, and it is a very big however, there have always been a very significant number of children who do not pick up reading. Since we've had decent information, that has varied from 20% up to about 40%, but it has never really dropped below about 20%, regardless of however much attention has been given to reading. Very, very importantly, that 20% always includes some of the most disadvantaged children in our society. This applies at the moment to a lot of schools in England. I know from my international work it applies to a lot of English-speaking countries right across the world. And yet, we now have a very, very significant number of schools teaching synthetic phonics alongside comprehension, where year on year, very high numbers of children, almost all children, high 90%, are turning out as effective readers. These are not leafy suburb schools. In fact, quite the reverse in most cases. They cover a whole range of schools, including a lot of schools in disadvantaged, challenging areas. Those schools, those 20%, which have for so long been failed by the system, are now learning to read alongside all the other children. This is not theory, it's not what I believe, it's what I know. I have been to a lot of these schools myself, and if you didn't believe me, I could take you along to look for yourself. These schools don't follow a single prescription. They don't all use the same program, or they don't all use the same materials or books, but they do share an understanding that children read most effectively by decoding unknown words rather than guessing at them. And when I say reading effectively, these children read with full comprehension and are developing real enthusiasm for books. It's a totally unmerited slur to say that these schools' teaching of reading is arid and mechanistic. They teach comprehension and vocabulary just as strongly as they do phonics. They have teachers who really share enthusiasm and love for wonderful books and reading. You could, by making sure that teachers have access to the right sort of information and training, be encouraging and supporting a system that would ensure that almost all children in Scotland learn to read, regardless of their background.
Okay, thank you very much for that. That's a helpful introduction. Can I maybe open up by saying, in your petition, you indicate you've written to the Scottish Government, Education Scotland, Times Education, Supplement Scotland, and the General Teaching Council for Scotland. Can I ask whether you've received any responses from any of these organisations, and if so, what sort of feedback you received?
Yes, I have received responses. I can give you a flavour of them here. Generally, it's been to sort of say thank you very much, but no thank you. We won't be pursuing it any further. I have a lot of papers here. This is from Jeff Maguire, Senior Policy Officer. Our understanding is that almost all Scottish primary schools use some form of synthetic phonics, and that this approach is combined with other strategies in the context of active literacy learning. Schools have a responsibility to respond to the needs of their own pupils. So for me, though, it's a misunderstanding of what I'm trying to achieve here. Yes, most schools in Scotland do use some form of phonics, but they're also using these other strategies alongside, such as multi-cueing, which amounts to word guessing. They're also using sight words. They're also using repetitive, predictable reading books, which it looks as if children can be in primary 1 and primary 2 reading well when they're reading these repetitive books, but effectively what has happened is they are simply memorising the words. So what can happen in schools is then we have in primary 3 or primary 4, once we come away from these repetitive texts, children's skills then break down because they don't have enough solid phonics knowledge to attack any new word they come across. I've also had a reply from John Swinney. This was very recently, this was the 9th of August 2017, where he states that he's not convinced it would be helpful to prescribe one particular approach to teaching reading. It would also contradict the philosophy of curriculum for excellence, which empowers teachers to choose the methods best suited to the needs of each child. But again, I feel this shows a misunderstanding. I'm not asking for synthetic phonics to be mandated, to be statutory, as it is in England. I'm simply asking that our teachers are given the access to and are informed about the most current international research when it comes to reading. I also have a problem with the idea that it contradicts the philosophy of curriculum for excellence. And I wonder whether we should be prioritising the philosophy of a curriculum which in my eyes, has yet to deliver the goods, so to speak, whether we should put that or teachers' right to choose from a flawed range of strategies. For me, it's more important that children get the correct research-informed reading instruction, and that shouldn't be left to chance.
Okay, thank you very much for that. Michelle Banting.
Yes. Good morning. You stated that other countries are getting better faster than Scotland, particularly in terms of beginning reading instructions. Why do you think that is the case?
Well, as of 2014 in England, systematic synthetic phonics has been mandated as the sole method for reading instruction. Also in Australia at the moment, they are trialling the phonics screening check, which originated in England. So I feel that lots of countries have been for a long time taking note of the research, which ironically really began in Scotland with the Clackmannanshire research. So other countries seem to be learning the lessons from our research, whereas we have chosen to do nothing and we've chosen to leave it up to teachers. But we've been doing that for the last 12 years, and without having all of the information they need, teachers can't. And that's through no fault of them. They can't make an informed decision because they're not in possession of all the facts or of all the research. So yes, I'm very concerned that in terms of our professionalism, our pedagogy, that we're actually falling behind other countries.
May I just pick up something that Anne said there in terms... I don't think, and I'm absolutely sure, synthetic phonics is not a method of teaching reading. It is something that children need to know in to be able to do it. There are lots of methods that you can use to learn it. It's like saying children need to count in mathematics. Of course they need to learn to count to be able to do it well. There are lots and lots of ways of teaching them how to count. That's not a method. Synthetic phonics is the same as learning to count. It's a basic skill that they need, that we know when they have it enables them to read well, as long as it's with all of the other things. But it's not a restrictive method. Schools can use lots of methods to teach it. It's content, not method.
Would it be correct to say that synthetic phonics is not a new idea? I seem to remember that's how I learnt to read rather a long time ago.
There is, if you like, an old way of teaching phonics, which has been around quite a long time. The thinking on synthetic phonics has now moved forward considerably from that. It is a much more complete, rounded system than the one that was used. So, you know, it has something in common with that. But what we now mean, which is now why training is so important, the understanding now of synthetic phonics has moved forward quite considerably.
Thank you.
Yes, thanks, Convener. Clearly, closing the attainment gap is very much on the radars of every single political party in this Parliament. But you state that there's now ample, secure and compelling evidence which shows that if children are taught to read, write and spell using a systematic synthetic phonics approach, the attainment gap and the gender gap can be closed. Could you expand on that a bit further, please?
So if you can imagine that there are a number of different ways in which you can teach children to read. So one of the ways is by encouraging children to use context in order to decipher an unfamiliar word. So a child sees a sentence and there's a word that they don't understand and that they can't read, so they use the context to work that out. A child needs to have good language skills and good vocabulary skills in order to do this effectively, and it's children from disadvantaged backgrounds who typically have the weak vocabulary skills who can't do this. Another approach to teach children to read words is through sight word recognition, where you show them a whole word and you ask them to commit that word to memory and remember what that word is. Now, for lots of children from disadvantaged backgrounds, when they start school, they know almost no letter sounds whatsoever. And so the way in which they remember these words is through visual cues. So they might remember, for example, in one school that I went into, children were being taught the words biff, chip and floppy. And children remembered the word floppy because it was printed on the largest card. Or they remembered the word biff because it had the last two letters were the same shape. So these are just abstract, meaningless symbols to students. Whereas students from more affluent backgrounds, if they're starting school with a knowledge of letter sounds, they might see the word biff, chip and floppy, and they may be making the connections between letter sounds and using that approach. So you've got use of context, you've got whole word recognition, and then you've got phonics. Now what phonics does is it redresses these kind of inequalities in knowledge when children start school, because right from the beginning of instruction, you're teaching children about the relationship between letters and sounds, and you're asking them to apply that. So for example, the first 3 letter sounds that they might be taught are a, n, t. And then they may be shown the words such as ant or at or tan, and then they're shown another letter sound like I, and then they learn to read the words pin, in, it, etc., etc. But what you're creating here is a situation where children from the more disadvantaged backgrounds are getting this critical letter sound knowledge right at the beginning, and you're not teaching children to read by a method which is dependent on vocabulary for good word reading success. And this is the way I think in which you would be able to close the poverty rate of attainment gap in word reading. But obviously phonics needs to be placed within a curriculum where you're also developing children's oral language skills as well.
In more practical terms, I could take you to hundreds, not thousands, but hundreds of schools where that actually is happening. And it's children with free school meals, children with English as an additional language, white working class boys, children from very difficult estates. They have no gap between those children and any other in terms of learning to read.
I'd like to just give you an example of some school stats from England to show you how that contrasts and compares with what we have in Scotland. So, for example, in East London we have Elmhurst Primary School. 52% of their pupils are disadvantaged. 96% of their intake have English as a second language, but despite the background, despite the circumstances of their children, they're achieving 94% of their children gaining equivalent of our second level at the end of primary 7 in reading. Compare that to our latest figure from teacher judgments was 72%. Also St George's Primary School, again in East London, 71% of their pupils are disadvantaged, 50% have English as a second language, but again 96% of their pupils, despite background, despite circumstances, are managing to achieve reading at a level that will allow them to flourish and access their secondary school curriculum.
I know both of those schools. A good number of those 6% or whatever who don't read by the end are children who've actually come to that school part way through the school.
Okay, thanks. Put like that, it's quite a compelling case. Thank you.
Brian?
Thank you, Convener. I'm interested in the list of benefits you believe would be achieved through the actions that you're calling for. And I'm particularly interested in this idea that you would be able to reduce the number of children being identified as dyslexic. I wonder if you could expand on that.
Going back to Elmhurst Primary School, I actually have a quote from the head teacher there who states that since 2014 and the introduction of a synthetic phonics programme, they've actually managed to eradicate dyslexia. So what's sort of happening in some of these schools is they're identifying fewer and fewer children with dyslexia. However, in my current experience, as I travel across Scotland and work with schools and teachers, we appear to be identifying more and more children with dyslexia. And what you will find is that the intervention approaches that absolutely work if someone has been identified as dyslexic are actually based on systematic synthetic phonics. So it's taking that teaching that works where children are struggling and applying that, if you like, to everybody. So it's harmful to no one in a class, but beneficial for everyone.
I mean, there is a neurological condition that's best called dyslexia that I think applies to about 1 or 2% of the population, nowhere near the 20% or so who are labelled as dyslexic at the moment. A lot of those children could be taught to read if they were taught to read properly.
Is that opinion?
No,
or is that,
no, that's fact. You know, the schools that we're talking about, as Anne said, have very few dyslexic children because they read. They all read.
And the fact that you stated there that the actual numbers of dyslexia are between 1 and 2% as opposed to the 20%, and I wonder,
well,
is that an evidence-based?
It is evidence-based, yes.
Okay.
Those are the ones who you can demonstrate clinically have some sort of neurological developmental condition. Most of the others the only real diagnosis for them being dyslexic is that they can't read.
I'd be interested to see that data,
Yeah.
if I may.
Well, yes, I haven't got it with me, but
Okay,
we
but
could
as I said,
we could find you some
that'd be
data on
great, I'd
dyslexia.
really
Yes,
appreciate that.
yes. But you remember, it is a controversial area, so people's definition of it does change.
You also believe that it would allow us to aim for 100% of children reading in Scotland, and can that kind of suggest that that's not the current aim? Am I correct in my understanding of that?
I mean, can I just say, I suppose from a research perspective, I believe that synthetic phonics has the potential to improve the literacy skills of children in Scotland. But what we do know is that even with children with the kind of most severest reading difficulties, when they're giving an intervention which aligns with best practice, about 10 to 25% of those children still don't respond to those, and they have very difficulties which we are not able to kind of remediate, I suppose. So synthetic phonics is not a cure for all literacy, but it is a way of ensuring that all children achieve better literacy skills and will particularly benefit children from disadvantaged communities. But you cannot promise 100%.
100% is too high. There will always be a few children who, for good reasons, struggle. But I think high 90% is totally achievable.
I'd just like to clarify that I did say aim for 100, and I do think we should be aiming for 100% of our children reading in Scotland. And to paraphrase you, Gordon, we should expect to get very close. It will only be in these 2 to 3% of cases where there are real and severe difficulties that we will be unable to achieve that. To sort of go back to your question, are we not already aiming for this? This is not current, but it will give you an illustration of what I'm talking about. As part of the Raising Attainment for All sort of meetings that had been taking place and conferences and so on. This was when Angela Constance was Education Secretary. Teachers and schools were signing on the wall, signing up to a commitment. They were signing up to stretch aims. And one of the stretch aims was that we would achieve 85% of our children achieving second level in literacy before leaving primary school. And my immediate reaction to that was, well, what about the 15%? I thought this was called Raising Attainment for All. And if we're serious about raising attainment for all, then we need to be aiming for 100% literacy for all of our children.
If you know teaching is being done effectively, then it is easier to identify those few children who have real problems.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning. This is happening in England. You've said you don't want it to be mandatory here. I'm just interested to know what your perception of the national guidance and training for teachers, support and resources would be here, and what information do you believe teachers don't have here already, you know, to carry this out?
I think it's quite difficult. I think the current documentation that we have in Scotland provides a very mixed picture. It's very difficult to find real and concrete information. Now, whether you're looking at the E's and O's, the experiences and outcomes, the actual curriculum, whether you're looking at the building the curriculum documents that go along with Curriculum for Excellence, whether you're looking at the POLAR resource, which is the primary one, Learning, Assessment and Action resource. These all present actually very contradictory things when it comes to reading. So although it might appear that at the moment Curriculum for Excellence isn't prescribing any particular method, actually when you look at the experiences and outcomes, because they mention sight vocabulary, they mention context clues, POLAR, for example, mentions letter names. These are all things that are part of a whole language approach, which is the opposite of what synthetic phonics is. So even though we think we're not prescribing anything, actually by including all of these things, we are. Even within the documents themselves, it can be confusing. This is from the Literacy and English Principles and Practice paper. Teachers will balance play-based learning with more systematic development and learning of skills and techniques for reading, including phonics. But then we have this from Building the Curriculum 2, active learning in the early years. There is no long-term advantage to children when there is an overemphasis on systematic teaching before 6 or 7 years of age. So the actual documentation there is not helpful for teachers, despite the the size and scope of the Curriculum for Excellence documentation, which, if you're familiar with the green glossy folder, which is enormous, it weighs 6.5 pounds. There's only a couple of lines on actual reading instruction there. I explore sounds, letters and words, discovering how they work together. I can use my knowledge of sight vocabulary, phonics, context clues, punctuation and grammar to read with understanding and expression. I am learning to select and use strategies and resources before I read and as I read to help make the meaning of texts clear. And that really is your lot. Despite reference to strategies 6 times in the document, it doesn't outline what those strategies are. But in many cases, these are being interpreted as multi-queuing strategies. So to give you an example, you've already...
Sorry, can I just stop you there? I wonder if you could just answer specifically. Do you think teachers are informed enough about this? Would they need special training?
Teachers do need special training. In the course of my day-to-day work, I regularly speak to audiences of teachers. Over the last 3 years, I've started now asking every audience for a show of hands. Please put your hand up if when you did your teacher training, you were taught how to teach reading. My most recent example of this, with a big audience, 72 teachers in Scotland, I had 3 hands up. And one of those teachers trained in South Africa, one trained at Murray House. I thought I had slept in the day that teaching reading was covered. I thought this was a personal problem for myself, something that I had missed, something that I lacked. But through my research, through speaking to teachers, I've discovered that we all have lacked access to this information.
When I said that these levels of attainment were possible, I very, very genuinely mean that. I never said it was easy. It has been a real uphill struggle in England, partly because there is such an extensive need for training, and that often includes the people who are providing the training at the moment, which makes life very difficult. And also there is 30 years of real ingrained prejudice and conservative thinking amongst teachers and teacher trainers that, have this anti-phonics attitude, that it is not to do with comprehension, that it is not to do with enjoyment of books, and that has been very, very hard to deal with and get past.
That was one of the points I was going to raise. Teachers often complain that they're subjected to too much change in curriculums and teaching methods. This would be another change, presumably. Well, and would you accept that resources are very stretched at the moment to allow the training of teachers to do this?
Yes, but we're talking about a change from 20% of children not being able to read to almost all children being able to read. Do not some changes just have to happen? I know it's not popular with teachers. I know they don't like it. But, we are failing thousands and thousands of children who could be given that gift of reading, which opens the door to so many other things, educationally and in life, and opportunities and everything. It is a price. Okay. My opinion is that it's a price that has to be paid.
Finally, Michelle.
Yes, thank you. In your petition, you suggest that by having national guidance to follow, teachers will be able to adapt their classroom practice accordingly. How would you address any of the potential concerns that having guidance to adhere to would restrict teachers' professional autonomy?
In terms of how synthetic phonics programmes can be delivered, there are a number of different ways in which they can be delivered. For example, they vary in the number of letter sound mappings which are taught, in the speed and pace of delivery, in the reading materials that accompany them, and in many other ways as well. So it's about understanding synthetic phonics and then understanding the specific students that you're teaching, what their needs are, and then adjusting the pace of your delivery, the number of letter sound mappings that you teach based on the knowledge of your students. So it's about educating teachers on the topic so that they do feel confident to be able to adjust it to their classes.
It's a matter of, I don't think, being honest with you now, I don't think imposition as such has worked in England. Those teachers that are doing it have been persuaded and shown all the evidence and why it works so well, and I don't know any teachers who are doing it. But remember, I think it's content. You're asking teachers to look at specific content, not at a particular method of delivery. So it's not.
Can
It's
I ask-
what they're teaching, not how they're teaching it, that's important.
Yeah, it's interesting you raise that, well, you know, you have to show them and they have to engage with it. Is your experience that once you've shown a teacher or a teacher has come with that knowledge, that their engagement is then high and that they then find synthetic phonics the primary way that they would choose to teach?
I know of no teachers who are doing it well who would want to do it any other way, because they can see that their children can read and can read with understanding and are enthusiastic and love books. And
So this is about outcomes ultimately.
but it's also about finding a way of getting people to understand, of winning hearts and minds, and the evidence is there, but it's really hard work to get them to look at it. Really hard.
How long does it take to train a teacher in synthetic phonics?
Can be done in a day.
Yeah. I mean, I offer professional learning sessions which last for 5 hours, and at the end, teachers feel confident, I think, that they understand it enough to be able to deliver it, and you do the same.
That big a challenge.
It's really, it's not that, no.
2 days would be good, I think. A day is possible, but it's pushing. A day with follow-up might be possible. 2 days, a few hours, no.
And then it's professional practice.
Yeah.
Can I thank you very much for that? I think that has been really interesting. One thing I would say, my recollection is pre-2011, the Labour Party had a commission on literacy. It was headed up by Rona Brankin at that time, and it talked about synthetic phonics, and it was accepted by the Scottish Government at that time. I think Mike Russell was the Education Minister. So this is something that there has been a conversation on. Equally, I sit in the Education Committee, and we had an evidence session with a group of people who were in initial teacher education, and they were concerned about the level of support they got in learning how to literacy and numeracy was very much a concern. So I think it's something that people are alive to as an issue, and I think people found that your presentation very, very interesting, I think. I wonder what we think we should do in terms of taking this forward. Angus?
Thanks, Convener. Just following on from your comment there about the work Rona Brankin's team did, I think it's worth pointing out that in 2010, Mike Russell, the Cabinet Secretary for Education at the time, said, "I agree that synthetic phonics has had considerable success." So that begs the question, if it was considered to have considerable success way back in 2010, then why has it not moved forward and become more commonplace? So I think the petitioners have made a very compelling case for synthetic phonics, particularly with regard to the evidence of children from disadvantaged backgrounds particularly benefiting. So I think we need to go back to the Scottish Government and ask what their current view is, and also seek the opinion of the EIS and the GTC in Scotland.
I think the other unions as well as EIS, the SST and NESUWT and other unions would be useful. Brian?
I think just following on from Angus there is that if we're going to write to the Scottish Government, I think we've had a sort of generic response, if you like. The petitioners already indicated that they had a response from the Cabinet Secretary. If we're going to ask that question, perhaps we could ask that question in reference to comments from 2010.
Yeah. And also include in the letter the evidence today that there's particular benefit to children from disadvantaged backgrounds.
Could we also ask for the evidence against using and embedding synthetic phonics? Because, you know, it seems to suggest there's a resistance from the Cabinet Secretary, and I'd like to know what that's based on.
Autonomy is in the context of professional responsibility and understanding. It's not completely random. You can just do whatever you like, and I don't think any teacher would argue that's what autonomy meant, but it feels as if that letter suggests that, but that's something that we can obviously explore with the...
There's an issue, and it was briefly highlighted or mentioned by the petitioners, that if those who are delivering teacher training don't know how to do it, they can't teach it, and therefore some resistance might come from that as well. So I think we should explore that with the Cabinet Secretary as well.
Could I very respectfully make one suggestion? It might not be your way forward, it might be into the future. I think dissemination of good practice is one of the most effective ways, rather than imposing it on people. You know, identify people who are already doing it well and get them to share their practice with other schools, so that it's school to school rather than top down.
Some of it is about confidence. I mean, I'm very struck about the evidence that we now have a strategy for teaching children to learn reading, which enhances the opportunities for those who already are advantaged because they've got those skills, because they've been, you know, and so a mechanistic approach which then affords the opportunity to then learn from the other stuff. You can see in terms, I mean, I just find that very compelling, that we've actually got strategies that are based on successes that are already there and not on understanding the disadvantage that some young people might have. It may be something, I don't know whether there are other educationalists and kind of the thinkers in Scotland, particularly around the colleges and universities who are doing initial teacher education, whether they have a view on this. Maybe something else that we could explore. Anything else? No? In that case, can I thank you very much for your attendance today. I think that was certainly very interesting, and it will be useful to explore why something that appears logical is perhaps, you know, there are people who have got some concerns about it, and I think that's how we would want to take it forward. But can I thank you very much for your attendance today, and we'll suspend until we allow the witnesses to move.